He walked through every room slowly. He walked through the drawing room, where my stepfather had arranged the silver on the sideboard as though for a buyer. He walked through the library, where the first editions had been dusted and turned spine out so their gilding would catch the light. He walked through the morning room, where my mother's pianoforte had been polished by a maid who had been weeping while she polished it, because the maid knew what the instrument had been to my mother, and the maid had loved my mother. He walked through the gallery, past the portraits my stepfather had never bothered to sell, because he believed, correctly, that the faces of dead Lattimers were worth nothing on the open market. He walked through every room. It took him 40 minutes. He said not a single word to any of us. Then he came back to the doorway of the front hall, where I was standing beside the umbrella stand with a ledger in my hands, because my stepfather had asked me, sharply, to fetch the household accounts in case the Duke wanted to examine the furnishings room by room. I had fetched them. I had been standing there for 40 minutes, while a Duke I had never met walked through a house I no longer considered my own, choosing something to take away from a man who had promised him anything. The Duke of Ashmont stopped in the doorway. He looked at my stepfather. He looked at the silver. He looked at the pianoforte, visible through the open morning room door. He looked at the portraits in the gallery beyond. And then, without raising his voice, without any theatrical gesture, without even fully turning his head, he looked at me, and he said one word. Her. I must take you back, because that one word destroys nothing unless you first understand what it was destroying. My name is Sophia Lattimer, and in the year I turned 19, my mother had been dead for 4 years, my father had been dead for 11, and I had been the legal ward of my stepfather, Reginald Croft, since the morning of my mother's funeral. He was my mother's second husband. She had married him 18 months after my father's death, for reasons I understood better the older I grew. She had been a widow with a small daughter, a house she could not afford to maintain, and a circle of friends who had begun to look through her the way society looks through women who are no longer useful. Reginald Croft had been handsome in a coarse way, and vigorous, and he had a competent fortune in shipping insurance. He courted my mother with flowers and with patience, and she mistook the patience for kindness, which is the most common mistake a lonely woman makes. By the time she understood him, she had signed over the house. She lived 7 more years. In those years, she taught me everything she could. French and Italian, and a practical competence in Latin sufficient to read the letters her oldest friend sent her from the continent. She taught me to play the pianoforte, though I had no talent for it, and to sing, for which I had some. She taught me to keep accounts, and to read a contract, and to recognise the particular handwriting of a lawyer who was cheating you. She taught me, above all, to watch. Sophia, she said to me once, in the last winter of her life, a woman in our position cannot afford to be seen. Be invisible. Stand in doorways. Hold ledgers. Fetch what is asked. Remember everything. Write none of it down where it can be found. I was 15. I asked her why. Because one day, she said, you will need what you have remembered, and on that day, no one will think to stop you, because they will not have noticed you were listening. She died the following spring, of a quiet lung complaint that my stepfather did not trouble to have properly attended. I watched her die. I sat beside her for the last 3 days, and on the last afternoon, she pressed into my hand a small gold locket, oval, with a miniature of herself painted by a friend when she was 22. The chain was worn, the clasp fragile. Hide this, she said. He will take it if he sees it, and do not let him know that I have given you anything at all. I hid it in the hollow of a book in my bedroom. the third volume of Hume's History of England, which my stepfather had never read and never would. And 2 weeks after my mother's funeral, when he came into my room to inventory her effects, he did not find it. He did not find either the packet of letters. My mother's closest friend, from the age of 16 until the day of her death, had been the Dowager Duchess of Ashmont. They had been at school together. They had written to one another every fortnight for more than 30 years. My mother had kept every letter, tied in packets by year, and on the morning of her last day, she had told me where they were and instructed me to burn them if I could, and to hide them if I could not. I could not burn them. I was 15, and I had just lost her, and the letters were the last thing in the world that remained of the voice of a woman who had loved her. I hid them. I hid them in a trunk in the servants' attic, in a room that had not been used since my father's time, behind a false panel my father had built for his own purposes. My stepfather never found them. What my stepfather did find, and this is the thing I did not know for another 3 years, because my mother had not told me, was a second packet, a smaller one, kept by my mother in a different place, for reasons that became clear to me only later. 11 letters, written between 1797 and 1802, from the Dowager Duchess of Ashmont to my mother. 11 letters that contained, among other things, a full and candid account of the circumstances surrounding the death of the late Duke of Ashmont, the current Duke's father, and the role his widow had played in concealing those circumstances from the world. The late Duke had not died of a fever, as the announcement in the papers had said. He had shot himself, in his study, after losing a significant portion of the unentailed estate in a single night of cards. The Dowager had burned the note, moved the body, and paid the attending physician an enormous sum to certify a natural death. Her son, the present Duke, had been 17 years old. She had never told him. She had told my mother, once in grief, and never again in writing except in those 11 letters, written at a time when my mother was the only person in the world she trusted. My stepfather found them 4 years after my mother's death, when he finally got around to emptying her writing desk. He understood, within an hour, what he was holding. For 3 years, from the time I was 16 until the week the Duke of Ashmont came through our front door, my stepfather blackmailed the Dowager Duchess of Ashmont by means of those 11 letters. He did it carefully. He demanded small sums. He framed them as loans. He framed them as investment opportunities. He never threatened outright. He hinted. And the Dowager, who was 67 years old and in fragile health and terrified that her son would learn the truth in a manner that would shame the family, paid. And paid. And paid. He never told his wife's daughter any of this. He did not imagine I was a person capable of understanding it. I understood it because I stood in doorways and held ledgers and fetched what was asked, and because my mother had trained me, and because a man who believes he is invisible to his dependents is a man who speaks freely in his own house. I knew the names. I knew the sums. I knew, by the end of the second year, roughly where he was keeping the originals. In a japanned box in his bedroom, behind a panel of the wardrobe, where he thought no one looked. I did not act on it. What was I to do at 17? I had no money, no adult relation who would shelter me, no legal standing. I kept my mother's locket hidden in Hume's history, and I kept her larger packet of letters hidden in the attic, and I held my ledgers and stood in doorways, and I waited. I did not know, precisely, what I was waiting for. What I was waiting for, as it turned out, was the current Duke of Ashmont to discover, in the summer of my 19th year, that his mother had been paying a man in Somerset £1,100 a quarter for reasons she refused to explain, and to come to our house in person to find out why. The morning of his arrival was a Tuesday in October. I remember the Tuesday because I remember everything about that day. My stepfather had received a letter the previous afternoon announcing the visit. He had read it twice, gone white, and then summoned the housekeeper, the cook, and myself in that order. To the housekeeper, he said, "The Duke of Ashmont will be here on Tuesday. Every surface in this house will be cleaned. Every window will be washed. If I see a single speck of dust, I will dismiss whichever of you was responsible." To the cook, he said, "There will be a cold collation ready at every hour from 11 in the morning until 7 in the evening. I do not know when he will arrive. I do not know how long he will stay. You will be prepared for any eventuality." To me, he said, "You will remain in the kitchen." "I beg your pardon." "You will remain in the kitchen for the duration of his visit. You will not be seen. You will not be heard. You are not, as far as this household is concerned on Tuesday, a member of the family. I cannot afford for you to appear at the door in your mother's old gown and be mistaken for a servant. I cannot afford for you to be mistaken for a member of this household either. You will stay out of sight." I looked at him. He was a man who had, by this point in my life, given me so many small humiliations that one more did not register with any particular sharpness. "As you wish," I said. On Tuesday morning, however, at 7 o'clock, before any other member of the household was awake, I went to the attic. I took the packet of my mother's letters from the false panel. I untied the ribbon. I read the letters, slowly, one by one, for the first time since I had hidden them 4 years before. I had never read them. I had been 15 when I hid them. I had not been ready to hear my mother's voice, in her own words, discussing her marriages and her grief and her friendship with a woman I had never met. I had waited. I read them now. I read references to Mrs. Ashmont, the Dowager, before her husband's title became hers, that went back 30 years. I read about a son, Edmund, who had been born 2 years before me, and who had been, in his mother's descriptions, a grave and watchful child. I read about a husband who the Dowager had, in the final letters, stopped mentioning, except in one brief passage in a letter dated November 1802. "E is holding up. I have not told him. I cannot tell him. He is 17, and he has just buried a father he idolised. And I cannot ask him to bear what I am bearing. I have asked the physician to sign what needs to be signed. I have paid what needs to be paid. I have burned what needed to be burned. I have kept, however, the note. I could not burn it, Mary. I could not. And I have hidden it where no one will find it. You will think me a foolish woman for keeping it. I think myself a foolish woman for keeping it. But it is all I have left of the last thing he wrote, and I cannot bring myself to destroy it." I read that passage 3 times. I thought for a long while about what I had been reading, about the letters my stepfather was using, about the letter, the note, that the Dowager had hidden and kept, about what a son would feel, learning all of this at 34, from the hand of a blackmailer rather than from his own mother. I folded the letters back into their packet. I retied the ribbon. I did not return them to the attic. I took them to my bedroom. I hid them inside Hume's History of England, alongside my mother's locket, and I went downstairs to be sent to the kitchen. The Duke arrived at 10:30. I did not see him arrive. I was in the scullery, peeling apples for a collation I would never see served. I heard the carriage and the housekeeper's heels on the front hall, and my stepfather's voice, his special voice, the one he used for titled visitors and magistrates, pitched half an octave lower than his natural register, and lacquered with a deference that would have been comical if I had not known what it cost him to produce. I heard the Duke's voice only once in those first minutes, a low response I could not make out. And then I heard my stepfather say, loudly enough to carry through 3 rooms, because my stepfather, when frightened, became performative. Your Grace, I cannot apologise enough for the misunderstanding. I assure you I will settle the matter at once. If there is any question of restitution, any question of satisfaction, take anything in the house, anything. I mean that sincerely. Walk through, choose what you will. I consider the debt a matter of honour, and I will not have you leave this house without some assurance of my good faith. It was the kind of speech a man makes when he has already calculated that his guest will be too well-bred to accept the offer. I set down my paring knife. I wiped my hands. I walked up the back stairs to the front hall, because a girl who has been told to remain in the kitchen is a girl whom no one will think to stop. And because I had spent 4 years waiting for something I could not name. And because I had, that morning, finally read my mother's letters. I reached the front hall just as the Duke emerged from the drawing room, with my stepfather trailing him at a deferential 2-pace distance. The housekeeper had set a ledger on a side table in case anyone asked for it. I picked up the ledger. I stood beside the umbrella stand. I said nothing. I held the ledger. My stepfather saw me. His mouth opened. He looked at the Duke, who had not yet noticed me. He closed his mouth. He could not, in front of his guest, order me back to the kitchen without drawing attention to the fact that there was a kitchen I had been ordered to. The Duke began his walk through the rooms. He walked through the drawing room. He walked through the library. He walked through the morning room, where he paused for a long moment at my mother's pianoforte and did not touch it. He walked through the gallery. He walked back. He stopped in the doorway of the front hall. He looked at my stepfather. He looked at the silver. He looked at the pianoforte. He looked at the portraits. Then he looked at me. He looked at me for perhaps 4 seconds. His eyes moved from my face to the ledger in my hands, and then to my mouth, and then back to my face. And I understood, in those 4 seconds, because I had been trained by my mother to understand things in 4 seconds, that he had not walked into this house without preparation. He knew who I was. He had been looking for me. Her, he said. My stepfather laughed. It was the reflexive laugh of a man who believes he has heard something that cannot possibly have been said. He looked at the Duke. He looked at me. He looked back at the Duke. Your Grace, I beg your pardon, I did not quite catch. You said I might take anything in the house. The Duke did not raise his voice. He did not alter his posture. He spoke with the flat courtesy of a man reading the terms of a contract. You said so in front of your housekeeper, who is in the corridor beyond that door. You said so in front of your butler, who is standing by the library. You said so sincerely, and you invited me to walk through and choose. I have walked through. I have chosen. Her. Your Grace, that is my stepdaughter. She is not an object to be. No, the Duke said. She is not. Which is why I am not taking her. I am asking her. He turned to me. He turned fully for the first time, and I saw his face without its composure. He was not as old as I had expected. He was 34, grave, clean-shaven, with dark eyes that had very little warmth in them, and a mouth that looked as though it had forgotten, long ago, how to do anything but deliver decisions. Miss Lattimer, he said, I am here in connection with a private matter that concerns your stepfather and my family. I have reason to believe that you have been living in this house under circumstances which have been less than honourable to you. I am in a position to offer you a change of those circumstances, immediately, on terms that will be explained to you fully before any commitment is asked of you. I am offering this without condition. If you refuse, I will leave this house without you, and without further mention of my proposal, and I will resolve my business with your stepfather by other means. If you accept, I will give you my arm, you will walk out that door with me, and you will not re-enter this house unless you choose to. The decision is yours. I will wait for your answer. I looked at him. I looked at my stepfather, whose face had gone the colour of a pond in March. I looked at the housekeeper, who had appeared in the corridor beyond the door, and was staring at me with an expression I had never seen on her before. Not surprise, but something closer to permission. "Your Grace," I said, "I have a ledger in my hands. It contains, among other entries, the household accounts for this year. It is not, however, the only ledger in the house. There is a second one, kept privately by my stepfather in a japanned box in his bedroom, which contains a record of the sums paid to this household over the past 3 years by your mother, the Dowager Duchess of Ashmont. I believe the figures will interest you. I would suggest that the ledger be secured before I leave this house, because I do not believe my stepfather will leave it intact once the door has closed behind us." There was a silence. My stepfather's face, which had been the colour of a March pond, now turned the colour of nothing. He said something. It was not a word. It was an intake of breath that was intended to become a word, and did not. The Duke looked at me for perhaps 3 more seconds. "Mr. Croft," he said without turning, "you will sit down in that chair, and you will not move from it until my solicitor arrives from London, which will be this evening. My coachman, who is a former sergeant of dragoons, will remain at the door of this house until my solicitor's arrival. If you attempt to leave the chair, or to remove anything from any room, he has my authority to prevent you by whatever means he judges necessary. Is this understood?" My stepfather sat down in the chair. "Miss Lattimer," the Duke said, "will you come with me?" I set the ledger on the side table. I walked to the front door. I did not take his arm, because I had not yet decided whether I would take his arm, but I walked beside him, and we walked out of the house I had lived in for 19 years, and I did not look back. Now, and this is the part I want you to attend to, because a life that begins on the steps of a house you are leaving is not, in fact, a life that has begun. It is merely a life that has been made possible. The Duke of Ashmont did not, as my stepfather surely believed, whisk me into a carriage and drive me to some romantic destination. He drove me to the vicarage in the next village, where the vicar's wife, a Mrs. Bellingham, of whom I shall say more shortly, had been forewarned of my arrival by a letter sent 3 days before. I was given a room. I was given dinner. I was given a bath, and a nightgown that fit me, and a door I could lock. The Duke did not sleep at the vicarage. He slept at an inn in the same village. In the morning he came to the vicarage, and he asked Mrs. Bellingham whether I would consent to receive him in her parlour, with her present. I consented. He sat across from me, with Mrs. Bellingham knitting in the corner, and he explained to me, in full and without omission, every detail of the matter that had brought him to my stepfather's door. He told me about his father. He told me about the blackmail. He told me that his mother, 2 days before, had finally broken and told him the whole of it. He told me that she had mentioned, in her confession, my mother by name, had said, weeping, that her oldest friend had had a daughter, and that my stepfather had, in his most recent letter, for the first time threatened not only the Ashmonts, but the child of the woman who had kept his secret. "He threatened you," the Duke said. "I do not know in what terms. My mother would not show me the letter, but she insisted, when she told me of it, that I must resolve the matter in a manner that did not leave you in that house. I agreed. I came here intending to extract you, by purchase or by stratagem, within the week. Your stepfather's offer saved me the trouble of a stratagem. And if his offer had not come, I would have offered him a great deal of money for you. He would have taken it. And the letters? I would have taken them back by force if I had to, after you were safely out of his reach. I thought about this for a long moment. Your Grace, I said. I appreciate the candour. I wish to be candid in return. I do not know you. I am, as of yesterday afternoon, a 19-year-old woman with no home, no settled fortune, and no living relation on whom I have any claim. I understand that your decision to remove me from that house was made with the best of intentions, and I am grateful for it. I am not, however, in a position to walk immediately into whatever future you have planned for me. I need to understand what you are proposing, and I need to understand it without any assumption on my part or on yours. I am proposing, the Duke said, that you allow me and my mother to arrange for your establishment in a manner consistent with your mother's station. My mother has a townhouse in Bath, which has been unoccupied for 3 years. It is yours, if you will accept it. She will provide a companion, a lady of her acquaintance, a widow of good family, who will live with you. She will settle on you a competence sufficient to live in comfort for the remainder of your life. This is offered without condition. You will owe me nothing. You will owe my mother nothing. She considers it a debt owed to your mother, and she wishes to discharge it. And what do you wish? He was silent for a moment. I wish, he said, for the matter of the letters to be ended. I wish for your stepfather to be prevented from troubling either of our families again. I wish for my mother to sleep, for the first time in 3 years, without waking at 4 in the morning. Those are the things I wish, Miss Lattimer. They're not things I expect you to provide. They are things I will arrange for myself by other means. I am telling you only so that you understand the whole of the situation in which I am involved. You have not mentioned yourself, I said. No. Why not? Because I do not know you, Miss Lattimer, and I will not propose an arrangement to a woman I do not know, simply because I admire the way she stood in a doorway with a ledger and named the location of a japanned box. I will not court a woman I rescued. That is not a foundation I am willing to build on. I looked at him. I looked at Mrs. Bellingham, who had stopped knitting and was pretending to be absorbed in the cat. Thank you, I said. That is the first sensible thing anyone has said to me in 4 years. I went to Bath. I lived in the townhouse with Mrs. Bellingham's cousin, Mrs. Wren, a widow of 50, sharp-tongued, warm-hearted, and impossible to impress, for 6 months. In those 6 months, I was fitted for clothes. I was introduced, gradually, to a small and carefully curated society. I visited the Dowager Duchess of Ashmont twice, at her request, at a house she kept in the country not far from Bath. I liked her. She wept both times she saw me, and I did not mind. She wept because I resembled my mother in the tilt of the mouth, and because I had, she said, my mother's stillness. The Duke wrote to me once a month, short letters, courteous. He reported on the progress of the legal action against my stepfather, which was considerable, and on the return of the letters, and on the arrangements being made to ensure that the blackmail could never be revived. He did not, in those letters, ever refer to a future. He referred only to the present business, and he signed each letter Ashmont. I wrote back once a month. I thanked him for the updates. I signed Sophia Lattimer. In the 4th month, my stepfather made a mistake. It was, in retrospect, the the mistake I should have anticipated, because a man who has blackmailed a duchess for 3 years does not become, overnight, a man who accepts defeat. He had one final lever he had not yet pulled. He had, the whole time, retained a copy of one of the 11 letters, the one that mentioned the note, and he had secreted that copy with a solicitor in London, with instructions to release it to the newspapers in the event of his arrest. He was arrested in the 5th month. The copy was released. I was sitting in the morning room of the Bath townhouse, reading a newspaper, when I saw it. I did not wait for a letter. I did not wait for advice. I wrote, that afternoon, to the Duke, and I said, "I have something you must see. I believe it is the answer to what has just been published. Come to Bath at once." He came in 36 hours. He arrived at 9 in the evening. He came directly from the road, mud on his boots, hair wet with autumn rain. I had laid out, on the table of the morning room, the packet of my mother's letters, the full packet, the one my stepfather had never found, the one I had carried with me out of that house in the lining of my travelling case. I had marked 3 passages. "These are the letters your mother wrote to mine," I said. "For 30 years. I have not shown them to anyone. I am showing them to you now because the letter that has been published in the newspaper does not contain what the public believes it contains. Your mother was protecting your father's reputation, yes. But she was also protecting a second thing, a thing the published letter hints at but does not name. She was protecting the fact that your father, before he took his life, arranged for the transfer of a significant sum from his personal account to a family in the village whom he had wronged in his youth. The sum was a restitution. It was the last thing he did before he went into his study. The note he left, the note your mother kept, was not a confession of despair. It was a direction to her to complete the restitution, which she did, and which she has never spoken of to anyone, including you, because she believed it was not her story to tell. The Duke stood very still. "How do you know this?" "Because your mother wrote it to mine," I said, "in the 3rd letter of 1802. She wrote it because my mother was the only person in the world who knew what had happened, and she needed someone to know what she was doing about it. I am showing you that letter now." I handed him the 3rd letter of 1802. He read it. He sat down. He read it again. When he looked up, his face had, for the first time in my acquaintance with him, lost its composure entirely. "This changes the published story," he said. "Yes." "This is, if I take this to the paper tomorrow, you take it with my blessing," I said, "but you will not take it alone. I will come with you. I am the daughter of the woman who received it. I will stand beside you in any public declaration you choose to make, because if we do this, Your Grace, we do it in a manner that leaves no doubt about your father, about your mother, about me, or about the man who has spent 3 years trying to destroy you all." He looked at me. "Sophia," he said, and it was the first time in any letter or in any spoken word that he had used my given name. "I did not come here tonight intending to say what I am about to say. I came here to read what you had found. I came here on business. But I find I cannot continue to pretend that I came here only on business." "Then do not pretend, Your Grace." "Edmund. Edmund. I have been in love with you, I believe, since the morning you stood in that doorway with the ledger and told me the location of the japanned box. I did not say so, because I had just rescued you, and I considered it a species of dishonour to declare myself to a woman who owed me her safety. I have watched these 6 months while you built yourself a life that owed me nothing. I consider that life yours. I would not interrupt it for the world. But I would ask, now, whether I might be permitted to be part of it, on whatever terms you think fair, over whatever span of time you think reasonable, with whatever conditions you think necessary. I am asking. I am not requiring. I will accept any answer you give me. I looked at him for a long time. I think, Your Grace, Edmund, that we have a newspaper to visit tomorrow. And I think that when that business is concluded, and when my stepfather is safely in whatever cell he is destined for, and when your mother has slept a full night for the first time in 3 years, I think that on the afternoon of that day, you may come back to this house and ask me that question again. And I will answer it. I will come back. I know you will. He came back. Of course he came back. That is not the suspense of this story, and I will not pretend it is. The suspense was what we did together in the 3 days that followed. We went to the newspaper. We told the whole of it, not the whole in the sense of every private grief, but the whole in the sense necessary to restore my stepfather's final letter to its proper context, and to destroy, permanently, his last weapon. The Dowager Duchess came to Bath on the 2nd day, and stood beside us when the clarification was published, and allowed herself to be seen, at 68, as a woman who had kept a difficult secret for an honourable reason, and had been punished for it. My stepfather was tried in the spring. He was convicted of blackmail and fraud, and sentenced to 14 years. He served 4 before he died in prison of the same lung complaint my mother had died of, which I noted when I read it in the paper, and which I did not mourn. The japanned box was recovered in the search of his house. Inside it, along with the records of the blackmail and the stolen letters and a great quantity of other documents detailing fraud I had never suspected, was my mother's locket. The one I had always assumed was the one I had hidden in Hume's history. I had been wrong. There had been 2, a pair made for my mother by the same painter, and she had given me the one and kept the one, and my stepfather had taken hers off her body on the day of her death, and worn it on his watch chain as a trophy. I had never recognised it in 4 years, because he had kept it face down. The Duke brought it to me himself. He did not say anything. He put it in my hand, and he closed my fingers around it, and he sat with me for an hour while I wept for my mother for the first time since her funeral. We were married the following autumn. It was a year and 3 days after the morning the Duke had walked through my stepfather's house. I wore a gown Mrs. Wren had chosen, and I carried in one hand a small bouquet of the white roses my mother had loved, and in the other, the locket. Both lockets now, joined on a single gold chain, warm against my palm as I walked up the aisle. The Dowager Duchess wept again, which I had by this point come to expect. Mrs. Bellingham sang. Mrs. Wren, who claimed to disapprove of weddings on principle, stood in the first pew and did not once take her eyes from my face. At the altar, the Duke turned to me. He looked at me for a moment before the vicar began, in the way I had grown accustomed to, carefully, as though I might at any instant change my mind, and he would need to have committed my face to memory in case he did not see it again. Her, he said, very quietly, so that no one but I could hear it. I laughed. It was the first time I had laughed at an altar. It was the first time, I think, that most of the guests had seen me laugh at all. Yes, I said. Her. Still. He walked through every room, slowly. He said one word. He dismantled a household in a single afternoon. But the life I was never supposed to have was not, in the end, the life he gave me. It was the life I stepped into when I set down the ledger. He opened the door. I walked through. And whatever has happened since, and a great deal has happened since, has been mine. because I chose it, and because my mother taught me, long ago, that a woman who has been made invisible must know precisely what she is waiting for, and must recognize it the instant it arrives.